Hello everybody! Thank you so much for tuning in to the Tobar Nua Retreat YouTube channel. We've been working very hard to bring you guys some content while we're not doing retreats with you. So our first topic today is actually going to be on fear. Fear can occur in our life in so many different ways, alright? Like when my boss calls me on the phone, that's where fear comes for me big time. When the guards are driving behind you, you know, you haven't done anything wrong, but you still kind of freak out a little bit. Maybe there's a situation at home, maybe there's a situation in your school, maybe you've turned on the TV and you're looking at the news reports and you're like, what is going on? So many different ways for fear to come into our lives. So when we do get that fear in our lives, we may want to ask ourselves, what does God say about fear? How does God want us to respond to fear? What should we do when fear enters our lives? When those situations happen, it might be good to ask yourself, well, what does God say about fear? Should I be afraid? Well, I have good news for you. The good news is that God actually doesn't want you to be afraid. In fact, the phrase fear not appears over 80 times in the Bible. And that tells me two things. One thing is that people genuinely had reasons to be afraid. And two is God said to them to not be afraid. So when God spoke, people wrote it down. So I'm going to look at an example in the Old Testament which says, "Do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand." This one because it shows this side of God where God is saying, hey, listen, if you're afraid, I'm going to not only be there with you, but I'm going to strengthen you. A lot of times people say, hey, you shouldn't be afraid, you know? That's not the way God works. God realizes that there's genuine situations where you're going to be afraid, but God wants you to know that not only will He be there for you, He wants to strengthen you if you need it. You see, that's what I really appreciate about God. God doesn't just say, here's what I want, deal with it. God is like, okay, if you're having trouble, I want to be there with you. And that's what I think makes God so amazing. So how can God help us? Well, the main way God helps us through difficult situations in our life is reminding us of the truth. A lot of times when we have a hopeless situation in our life, it's because we're actually believing a lie and not the actual truth. So how do we remind ourselves of that truth? Jesus said that He was the way, the truth, and the life. And the truth is, God has said that He has not given us fear, but actually something to overcome the fear. And for that, I want to look at the New Testament and a book called 2 Timothy. For God has not given you a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and a sound mind. So, when you are afraid, remind yourself that God is going to be there for you and God has given you the power to overcome that fear. That is our lot for today. It's just a tiny little snippet about what God says about fear. So a good idea to do would be to find out some verses for yourself. Write them up in places that you see and just remind yourself when you're being anxious, when you have that bit of fear in your life, when a bit of doubt begins to creep in, remind yourself of what God has given you, the power to overcome fear. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll hopefully have more content coming in the next few weeks. God bless.